Hey, so today we're going to be talking about Lehi leaving Jerusalem and the kind of psychological insights that I've received from reading these stories. So we see here that Lehi, who in the last episode I feel represents that older, humble, righteous part of us in the midst of a psychological turmoil where perhaps so much of us just feels convinced that because of our association with God and our association with even the covenants of God, that the internal work is done. Um, as we see later on in the Book of Mormon, the goal of the gospel is Zion. And the internal work or the internal goal is a Zion of our own interpersonal subparts and everything that we have inside of us. And if that's not complete, well, then the work is not complete. And so the biggest sin of the Israelites in Jerusalem, or the Jewish people in Jerusalem, is just not recognizing that and actually killing and hating and seeking to destroy the prophets who were calling those into repentance. Now, there were a whole bunch of other sins, of course, but that is what I see as the state. So the Book of Mormon starts off in this internal psychological state. If you see everything at the state of Jerusalem as representing the state of the people who would essentially be reading the Book of Mormon, we just believe that we are correct with God. And so Lehi, or as Lehi represents that part of us that's humble, gets that call to leave that state. And so when you start reading the Book of Mormon, it can work in your heart, even subconsciously. I believe a lot of these insights can come through the Spirit, through the power of God. And I'm just trying to articulate these insights that I've received. But through God and through the righteous people who will listen to God, God creates a new nation where his ways can be lived. And so in us, it's like we have this righteous part of us that is receiving that call and that prompting to leave those negative mindsets, to leave that mindset that we're all good, because we're not. Because that part of us that believes it's all good and it's all righteous, even though the association is basically the only thing righteous about them, but the internal work isn't done, that call to leave is a mercy and a warning, because the destruction is soon to come. And so we move on to the next part where Lehi is getting prepared and getting his family all ready to actually leave. So I think it's interesting here how it says that Lehi's family packed food and tents, and it shows that there is an order. You can't just get up and leave. You have to consider your shelter, you have to consider your food, you have to consider all the aspects that still promote life. And so if we have these ideas, that part of us that feels like we need to change, you still need to be provided for. You can't just immediately change. There has to be a system, there has to be an order, there has to be preparation, spiritual preparation, so that we can change from this, oh, I believe in God, I'm already saved, to there's still a lot of internal work and a lot of internal healing that needs to be done. And that righteous part of me that is feeling called to leave so that the other parts of me can perhaps be destroyed or reorganized or woken up, that part still needs nourishment, still needs sustenance. And maybe it's not receiving the sustenance from the rest of us. Maybe our internal psychological system is not really taking care of the needs of our humble, righteous parts. But through God and through even just a small part of us willing to listen to God, it can still make the proper mental preparations to go on this journey, this spiritual, psychological journey. And when they're talking about gold and silver, I think in our internal psychological state, what does gold and silver represent? I believe that there's an economy between our ideas and our sub-personalities. Perhaps our mother, who represents a big matriarchal part of us that reigns over a whole bunch of other parts of us, they have more weight and more riches and more power. And so the gold and the silver, that money, is a manifestation, a numerical manifestation of the value and power that we give to certain ideas. And so if we completely value, for example, this humble and prosperous and good person, well, then they're going to have a lot of wealth. And so Lehi actually in Jerusalem has a lot of money, as far as I understand the history. And so he had a lot of wealth. So at one point, this society was able to value him because of his work and input, to the point that he developed a lot. But what happens with that switch as he is awakened through God and into the state, in the internal state of the people, is that he becomes a threat to their way of life. Instead of a value add by helping them with food and shelter and access to resources, he's now switching his efforts to access to spiritual power, but that access to spiritual power completely cuts against the values. And so people are trying to seek to kill Lehi. And so internally in us, there may be a part of us that is hardworking, that is righteous, and that's wanting to do good. But as soon as that part gets a little bit of power and gets a little bit of an insight to say, hey, maybe we need to change things up here, well, then there goes business with that. And we're constantly feeling anger towards that part of us. And that part of us needs to find its own internal value that it's had and take it with it. Or actually, no, wrong, not take it, but leave it behind, which is interesting. That there's a very interesting connection to that humble part of us leaving behind the money because it's not important. Or I don't know why they left it behind. Perhaps there wasn't enough time to take it, or perhaps the Lord told them. But as it's seen here, that money is still useful to them later on, even though it didn't work essentially in the whole trying to acquire the plates from Laban. As we continue on into the rest of the portion of the Book of Mormon that we're looking at, I try and find a lot of connection to what sons mean, or what masculinity represents in us, because I believe that all of us have those masculine and female parts, and to have four sons, I think represents four different patterns or ideas or logistical things or rational things within us, whatever is typically culturally considered masculine, either at the time or archetypally throughout all of humanity. That's what males are. In scriptures, male represent those parts of us. And to have the fight between brothers archetypally with Cain and Abel shows how two different values, two different ideas can collide and can clash within us as well. And as we see here, we have the foundation for that archetypal clash and collision with Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. So the traveling family goes and stops. They're not constantly walking, but they take breaks here and there, and they set up here and there in different locations. I like how it says here that in the story we have Lehi camping next to a river. Now they are far away from society. They are far away from easy access through money to just get their resources. So there's a lot of self-reliance that comes in this journey of removing oneself from their customs and society. And so as Lehi archetypically represents moving away from old and corrupt ideas, as we're doing that, that can reflect externally in our own systems. I know when people are being converted to Jesus or to the Lord in almost any religion, they have a series or a set of friends that are not that. They're all going together, they're all having fun, they're all having partying, they're all worried about what the next fix is going to be, and then someone starts to maybe think that's not life. Life is more than this. Life also involves Jesus. Well, then there's some pushback to that. And with that pushback, that can lead to a division where someone starts to say, hey, these friends aren't going to be good for me, so I'm going to leave. I'm going to pull away from that. and then you're on your own. You lose your social network. You lose your ability to quickly go and have fun times or someone to talk to. Perhaps maybe they weren't the best people to talk to, but they were at least someone. And so Lehi leaving that culture, that civilization, and having to fend for himself also shows in our psychological journeys as we leave these old notions and these old ideas behind, particularly in regards to religion, as Jerusalem represents this form of religion that has become corrupted. And so as we leave our own corrupt theologies, our own corrupt relationship with religion, we have to fend for ourselves. However, the Lord is still guiding Lehi in his journey. And as we'll see here, there's a lot of provisions and miracles that God has for those who leave because they're doing what God asks. And God asks all of us to leave our corrupt religions, our corrupt ideas, and our attachments to sin so that we can get to a land of promise. And that land of promise being an internal state where what we do in harmony with God will actually have the benefits and blessings and consequences of that. So as we come over to this next image, and I'm kind of going image by image, because if I were to try and do a deep psychological analysis of every verse and word, I don't think I'd ever get done. So I'm going to just try and go through the images as I kind of break up the story into visually interesting parts. Here we can see that even though Jerusalem hasn't been destroyed yet, we only get a confirmation through vision that Jerusalem has been destroyed after Lehi and his family have gotten to the Americas. We see here that Lehi is creating an altar and making an offering to God and thanking God for not being destroyed. He's talking as if it's the present, but not actually yet. And so Lehi knows that whether Jerusalem is destroyed in the immediate or whether Jerusalem is destroyed now, he knows that the ways and culture of the people at the time in Jerusalem, it's already as good as destroyed, which is why the Lord is reaching out and saying, hey, you need to get out here because their destruction is basically already solidified. It's just a matter of time. And so I'm thinking about how in our internal journeys to kind of leave these old corrupt religious ideas or theological ideas or moral ideas or values that we've had, we sometimes we are aware that part of us, that righteous part of us, that humble part of us knows that whether we were going to be destroyed immediately or are destroyed now or will be destroyed, it doesn't matter, that part of us needed to have been taken away and left, or else it was going to lead to destruction. And so I think several times in my own life where the law of chastity is something that I've had strong temptations to just break. And I think about how I'm so glad that I didn't do it and I've left those temptations, because whether or not those temptations actually destroyed me or destroyed my life doesn't matter. Those temptations will always lead to destruction. And so just being saved from those temptations, having a change of heart and leaving that way of thinking and valuing breaking the law of chastity over living the law of chastity, that was always going to lead to destruction. And so it's equivalent to say that I was saved from destruction that already happened, or that I was saved from destruction in the future, because everything to God is one eternal round, and what is inevitably going to lead to destruction can be treated as already destroyed or destroying. The symbolism of Laman and Lemuel being told to be like a river in a valley, I think Hugh Nibley has some amazing insights into this, where essentially the Laman and Lemuel represent two different styles of disharmony with God, where a river is very fluid and moving and life-giving, and so perhaps one of the brothers was more rigid in their thinking, while the other brother was very loose in their thinking, and they're not in the flow of life that is both a river and a valley, where one is steadfast and immovable and the other one is constantly flowing and changing with the times. It feels almost like the divide between the progressive mindset and the conservative mindset. When you're too strict and orthodox, you're not going to be able to change to address future or evolve or or address the things that are constantly changing if you're too stuck with the past and not trying to track the eternal principles rather than what's worked in the past. And then again, if you're too, let's say, progressive, I don't want to make a lot of political assertions, but if you're too open to new ideas, you're not steadfast, you're not immovable, you're not holding yourself to those eternal principles that actually will help you move forward. And so the two principles of righteousness include the steadfastness and the continually flowing. It includes being able to hold firm to those things that are eternal, and also being able to change and letting go of things that are not eternal, are temporary. And right here, the Laman and Lemuel representing how we sometimes doubt because we love the corrupt religion or corrupt ways. We don't see what's wrong with it. And so that part of us that doesn't see what is wrong with those old ways of thinking, we're not going to imagine a possibility where those old thinking actually lead to destruction. So if we are completely into our status, for example, and how our big house or our nice car actually has value and status in society, we can't possibly see how continuing to hold on to that will eventually lead to destruction. And maybe it hasn't led to a visible destruction yet. It could have been just a spiritual destruction, but ignoring that can ignore how continual love of a certain thing, of a corrupt mindset, will eventually lead to destruction. But if we are like Laman and Lemuel, either perhaps too steadfast, or not too steadfast, too stuck in our ways, or too go with the flow, then we're not going to be able to see that those old ways of thinking actually will lead to destruction. Now, Nephi, having that desire to learn about the vision that his father had, is that part of us, I believe, that is growing. So Lehi represents a part of us, but Nephi also represents a part of us that stems from that righteous and humble part. So our ideas are constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly multiplying and flourishing into new ideas. And so we have an idea. We have a righteous part that is listening to God. And then the children of that, or the new ideas and the new desires and the new values that come from that, they may not always necessarily agree with or understand why they came out or why we're going through that. And so one part of us knows, but the other parts that are kind of willing to know, but they're struggling, they represent Nephi, or Nephi represents them. And so what happens is we can convert the rest of our parts to that one part that is righteous and that actually starts on the journey to get away from those corrupt mindsets. That part can submit and pray and learn. And what's interesting is that Nephi is not trying to understand it through his father, understand it through God. And so with us, those parts of us that are similar to that righteous part that is trying to leave our old mindsets, but is slightly different and is slightly confused, that time, that moment in our life where we're still slightly confused about why we're trying to cut certain things out of our life, that part needs to have its own personal revelation. And so what's fascinating is that in the church, we talk about how every single person needs to have a testimony in order for us to move forward as a people and to do the work of God. Well, I believe also all of our internal parts, every single part of us, whether it is part of our life in work, part of our life in school, part of our life with our families, our relationship with our wife, our relationship with our spouse, or our relationship with one child, or our relationship with our father, all these different relationships and associations that we have, each part needs to have its own conversion experience. We can't just accept that I'm converted to God wholly. We have to understand that all of us needs to be converted to God, and that includes all the individual parts. And so while we may, have this desire to go to church and to read the scriptures and do stuff, if we still don't have that conversion in our dealings with our fellow men, or in our business practices, or in our relationships to people that we meet down the street, then those parts of us still need that conversion experience. And so that's why I love the story of Nephi talking to the Lord and having his own testimony. Is because we all need our own testimony. We can't just depend on our parents, but also all of our own internal sub-personalities and So my phone ran out of storage, but to continue on with what I was talking about, That's why I love Nephi and what he represents in our own internal psyche, that all parts of us need to be converted to God, not just one part of us that kind of runs the show, essentially. And here we see how once one part of us gets converted, other parts of us are motivated to get converted and even share that with the rest of us. So as God works through all of our individual parts, that desire to kind of spread out into all different parts of our life. We're so happy with how we're involving God in our work. We want to also involve God in our family, or as we involve God in our family, we also want to involve God in our work. And that spreading of the enthusiasm and conversion to God is shown here and is seen here as Nephi is talking with Sam and his brother. What's fascinating is this promise that the Lord has for Nephi, that he would be blessed and become a leader over his brothers, essentially showing that there are parts of us that may not convert or that may not be fully converted, and that is okay. It is okay in the sense that there are parts of us that either only believe or are friendly to those other parts that are more passionate. And the structure that God has is that those parts that are fully converted, those parts that are more converted, those parts that are more righteous and more willing to sacrifice, they can be the leaders. They can be the ones to be looking up to. And the other parts that perhaps haven't done the proper sacrifices, or haven't fully consecrated themselves, or haven't fully repented, or haven't fully understood or converted to God, that they can still participate in this order of happiness and joy if they only value God above all things and those who are closer to God, essentially. And having that distinction, that hierarchy of what it means to be closer to God is a finicky subject. And so when I'm saying closer, I'm thinking more in line and in harmony with the ways of God, involving issues of righteousness, service, love, order, justice, mercy, all that stuff. And so with that, we end with this episode, and hopefully you've learned something interesting about the Book of Mormon, or a different approach to how to see these characters of the Book of Mormon and how they kind of map to our own internal psyche. And I hope that as I continue to do more of these videos, that I can better formulate my videos to be interesting and engaging, and to present a different way of reading the scriptures that still honors the literal interpretation, the historicity of the Book of Mormon, and values the metaphorical applications, and how we can use the Book of Mormon and apply them to our own selves and our own internal problems and our own internal psyche to gain mental health issues, for how to be better individuals, better followers of Jesus Christ, and to find healing from all the different corrupt things, or things that are not in harmony with God, so that we can enter into the wonderful states of Zion, as talked about in the Book of Mormon, and understand what an internal Zion means for us. Because as we receive that healing, as we receive that conversion, as we do the work in our own internal psyche, we can help further build the kingdom of God in us, starting in us, and then starting in our family and the people that we work with, and eventually to the church and the whole world. And so I know that as we read the Book of Mormon with this mindset of trying to use it as a Urim and Thummim to identify these archetypal patterns and see what they can represent in our own mental world and mental states and spiritual state and emotional understandings and stuff, we can have those insights, and God can use those insights to guide us personally, to know where we are spiritually, what is our state spiritually, and what are we called to do in order to receive that healing. So thank you for watching.